So I'm going to talk to you about the thing that I consider the most fascinating thing in the universe, and that is the human brain. And I'm going to take for granted that since you are here in this room, you share with me my fascination for the brain and how it works. It gives rise to a stunningly diverse set of abilities to our thoughts, perceptions, actions, and emotions. And it does this with a biological organ that consists of billions of interconnected cells, of nerve cells, that turn on and off and communicate with each other at the speed of electricity to send information through the brain and generate meaningful thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. And really, the grand question of neurobiology is how this incredible ability arises from this simple biological organ, these 3 pounds of material, that are more complex and more versatile than anything we as humans have been able to build with all of our technologies and machines. And we want to understand how these billions of nerve cells generate these complex and meaningful patterns of activity. And that is what our field does. And so I think it was with great excitement and also surprise to our field when in the State of the Union address in February of 2013, President Obama said something about the importance of understanding the brain. Now, I've been in this field for almost 30 years, and I cannot remember any other time that a president said that studying the brain was important. And that was really exciting. It's not often that that happens to you, but at the same time, it was a little bit perplexing because at that point, no one seemed to know exactly what he was talking about. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times the next day in which the director of the National Institutes for Neurological Disorders and Strokes, which is the largest funder of brain research in the United States, said something like, well, we're not sure what he's talking about. So that was a surprise, and people were interested and puzzled, and I was interested and puzzled, and then it started to take shape, and then I was even more surprised when I realized that I was going to be responsible for finding out what this was, actually. So what happened on April 2nd, 2 months later in the same year, is that there was an announcement at the White House in which the president announced something called the BRAIN Initiative, brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies. And the key words here are research and innovative neurotechnology, developing tools and technologies to promote research on the brain. And this was announced with the partnership of 3 government agencies, including the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, and DARPA, which funds defense research, as well as a number of partners, including the Allen Institute for Brain Sciences, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and the Cobley Foundation, so, as well as the Salk Institute. So with great excitement, it was announced that there was going to be an initiative to unlock the mysteries of the brain, to give scientists the tools they need to get a dynamic picture of the brain in action, and to understand how we think and learn and remember. So where I come into this is that this is the statement that the White House made, and it was now the job of the scientific community to decide what that meant. And of course, the president turned to this man here, who is Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, who was also one of the leaders of the Human Genome Project, and therefore has experience with putting together scientific programs to try to really advance a field and take it to the next level of sophistication. But Francis Collins, although I think of him now as a born-again neuroscientist, is not, in fact, primarily trained in this field. And his decision was to not do this himself and to not even do this with the expertise within the National Institutes of Health, but to try to build a new program in brain science through the best thinking of the neuroscience community from outside the field. So he gathered together a variety of different scientists, including me from Rockefeller and Bill Newsom from Stanford, and asked the group of us here together to formulate a plan for what it would really take to understand the brain, what it would really take to understand how we think and how we feel and how we remember, as we were charged to do at the announcement of the initiative. And this is a slightly more technical version of that same question. What would the technologies be that would be needed to construct a picture of the brain that integrates all of its activity over time and space, that gives rise to its unique abilities? And within the group of people who were chosen to start to put together this plan, there was an implicit message about what that would require. Because within this group of people, there's me, I'm a basic neuroscientist and geneticist I work on a tiny organism. There was also Bill Newsom. My co-chair works on non-human primates to study complex cognitive properties. But there were also people, for example, who did surgery on human patients. There were people who are experts in statistics and on higher order mathematics. There was a chemist, there was a physicist. So there was a clear statement on here that there were going to be a set of scientists involved in this project who were not the usual people involved in neuroscience, that this was going to require stepping outside of the comfort zone of the field of neuroscience to incorporate physics and engineering, chemistry, computer science, and mathematics. And this group of people were charged with the idea of putting together a program for what the Brain Initiative would really have to be. And we were accompanied by ex officio members who were planning the corresponding programs, not only at the NIH, but also at DARPA, NSF, and even the Food and Drug Administration, to listen to our reflections, to help us learn more about the government. I've learned a lot about the government. Some good, some bad, and to help us guide us through this process. So 2013 was, in fact, a very big year for brain research, because not only was the Brain Initiative launched, but in Europe, in October 2013, the Human Brain Project, a different brain project, was announced and officially started. And this is a very different project with very different goals. This is a project to do a computer simulation of the entire brain. It's really a computing project and an informatics project. So it comes from a different background and it comes from a different perspective. On the one hand, a biology project in the United States, on the other hand, a computing project in Europe. And I think these projects will meet one day, and we can talk later about how these will intersect with each other. But for now, I think the main point is that there's a lot of excitement and a lot of interest in learning more about the brain. And so the question is, why is this happening? What are the reasons for learning more about the brain? And I should say, I think it's important to just start with the fact that there are many reasons to learn about the brain, but the main reason that Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, was motivated to join this project and commit their resources to it is that there is an urgent need to learn more about the brain as a way to address unmet needs in brain disorders. So brain disorders strike at any point in life. They might strike in childhood, when the neurodevelopmental disorders like autism might first be shown. They might strike in young adulthood, where thought and mood disorders like schizophrenia, for example, or depression would appear. And of course, they are very serious concerns among our aging population in the form of neurodegenerative disorders, with disorders like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. There are 5.5 million people in the United States with Alzheimer's disease. This is not only a human tragedy, but it's actually a considerable burden on our medical system and even our economic system. The annual cost of caring for these patients is $200 billion per year, and it's going up. And a sobering fact about many of these brain disorders is that we do not know how to treat patients with these disorders successfully. Now, there are examples on this list of disorders where we have successful treatments. There are good therapies for epilepsy and seizure disorders. There are therapies for depression that can affect at least half the people who are affected. We have good treatments for Parkinson's disease, and it's probably worthwhile mentioning here how important Rockefeller faculty member Paul Greengard was in the understanding of Parkinson's disease and the mechanisms that go wrong in that disorder. But the fact is, for many of the others, we do not have treatments. We do not have effective treatments for schizophrenia that address its most profound effects. And in fact, we haven't developed a fundamentally new drug for schizophrenia since 1970. We do not have great treatments for Alzheimer's disease. There have been 12 major clinical trials in the past few years that are based on our best biological understanding of this disease, and yet none of them succeeded. So there is a huge impact on brain disorders, on the quality and quantity of life among our people, and there's a real need to try to do something about that. And what we know now is that as we look at these disorders, we're actually seeing the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology industry leaving this field, taking research and resources away from this field. And this is not because they don't care about these disorders, and this is not because they couldn't ultimately succeed based on treatments for these disorders. It's because when you've had 12 clinical trials fail, you can't do a 13th clinical trial using the same approach. And if you ask them why they're stepping away, they say, we don't understand enough about the brain. We need new approaches to study the brain. And that has been the idea of the BRAIN Initiative. The basic underlying idea of the BRAIN Initiative is that instead of studying disorders one at a time, instead of breaking the problem down into individual components, let's try to build a foundation of understanding of the entire brain and use that foundation to try to look at all of these different problems, which of course are affecting the same fundamental organ. They are affecting our brains, and understanding more about our brains in general will shed light on all of these processes. So how can we do that? How can we generate these new ideas and approaches? We needed a process. We needed a way to put the best thinking in science together. And even though there were 15 people on that committee of really spectacularly successful people, each prominent in their own field, and each prominent in a different field, that is not enough to represent what you need to know about neuroscience, or even what we know about the brain now, let alone what we need to know. To give you a little bit of a perspective, there are probably 40,000 members of the Society for Neuroscience, the clinical and basic and translational neuroscientists who study the brain at different levels. So we had to reach out. We didn't want to just talk among ourselves. We wanted to know what that whole neuroscience community thought was important and how we could go about addressing that. And so we went on a tour, on a US tour, traveled around the country and had meetings in different cities in the country, addressing different topics that we thought were generally important in understanding the brain. For example, the molecular and genetic basis of the brain, how to record from brain cells, theory and computational approaches, human brain imaging. And in each of these cities, we would have a workshop. We would bring in experts from those areas who would give presentations. We would invite other scientists to attend. We would invite the public to attend and give commentary. And from this, we identified a first set of goals and an interim plan that was presented in the fall of 2013 to the National Institutes of Health and presented to the world as a way of gathering feedback on what our ideas were about how brain research should proceed. And I have to say, it's like you put this out there and then you duck. But not much came flying. And so we realized we had to get feedback by actually going out and looking for it. So then we spent the next 3 or 4 months after that asking all of the different communities and interested parties what they thought about this project, what is missing, which of these ideas need refinement, what seems extraneous. And so we had conversations with people in person, we had presentations at many national meetings, we got feedback from as broad a community as possible, including, for example, not only the leadership of the Society for Neuroscience, but that general membership I told you about. We went to the meeting and presented and asked them to talk to us. We realized that although this was always stated as a fundamental basic science goal to build up understanding of the brain, that the groups that we really want to gain access to this information include people involved in clinical neuroscience, in neurology, and psychiatry, and neurosurgery. And so we contacted the leadership of all of the major clinical neuroscience societies, and we asked them, what do you see here? What do you think is missing? What do you think needs to go out? And in fact, they invited us to write pieces for their journals to reach their membership as well. We met sort of prestigious scientists in the National Academy of Sciences. We met members of other scientific organizations. And we met with every single one of the other partners, private and public, that were identified in the initial announcement to say, here's what we're thinking, what are you thinking? Are we going to be duplicating things? Are we going to be able to work together? What things can we do that will make the maximum benefit out of this? Because the brain is very complicated, and there's plenty for everyone to do. And so really getting some sort of communication going between those groups was part of the process. And then finally, we spent several months meeting again, talking to other people, putting together everything we had learned, and turning that into a practical set of recommendations for what it would actually take to understand the brain. And that was published in a document called Brain 2025, A Scientific Vision. You can get that from the National Institutes of Health webpage, and I would say that the first 30 pages or so are actually meant to be readable by an interested layperson. You could get it, and you might actually even enjoy it. And so this is the procedure. So what did we emerge from? How do you do this? How do you take something like, we need to solve the brain, and choose what it would actually take to do that? And so what we had to do was to think about what's already out there, what do we already know, and what pieces are missing for us to really reach an understanding of the brain, both in health and in disease. And then also what kinds of tools and what kind of infrastructure is needed to acquire that understanding. And we had to keep in mind throughout all of this that the Brain Initiative is a great project, but that it is not going to replace studies of individual disorders. That the Brain Initiative, for example, in this year is only 1% of the budget that the NIH is spending on neuroscience, although the plan is for that to increase. But in order for it to really have an impact, it's going to have to really be valuable for the people doing disease-based research, for the people doing focused experiments. And it's our belief that technologies, if we can get them into the right hands, will really support all of NIH research. So we looked at the field, and here's what our analysis of the field is. It's as follows. We've been studying the brain for about 100 years as a scientific community. And the problem with the human brain is its incredible complexity. So your brain has 86 billion nerve cells in it. That's 10 times as many nerve cells as there are human beings on planet Earth. And each of those nerve cells has a pattern of becoming active and inactive that transmits information to about 1,000 to 10,000 other nerve cells. And it also receives information from 1,000 to 10,000 other nerve cells. So these guys are all worked together into one gigantic network that consists of billions of neurons with trillions of connections. And until now, when we've studied the brain, we've been able to study it one of two ways, and we've learned a lot from those two ways. The first way is that we've been able to study individual neurons and their connections with each other. So Torsten Wiesel, a Rockefeller professor, was, together with David Hubel, one of the first people to be able to record, to listen to the activity of a neuron in the brain of the visual system, and hear what that neuron said when it responded to light, and understand from that how the brain begins to see. So at a level of a single nerve cell, you can start to see something about what the brain is doing. And this has been supplemented over the past 30 years with tremendous advances in molecular biology and genetics. So in many cases, we can not only look at those nerve cells and listen to them, but we can say this particular activity of the nerve cell results from a certain molecule that has certain properties that makes the neuron able and capable of responding in this or that way to a stimulus. And so here at the very microscopic level, we also have a good understanding of the brain. On the other hand, we also have an understanding of the brain as a whole. And we have an understanding of the big parts of the brain from fields like neurology, and also more recently from fields like functional brain imaging. I'm sure that many of you have seen pictures of parts of the brain that light up when different things happen. This movie shows a person either watching a film, go back, and when he watches the film, that's in red, and when he listens to the soundtrack, that's in blue. And you can see that different things are happening. So it turns out that the back of your brain is where visual input comes in, and these sides here is where auditory input comes in. And so we have this kind of a view of the brain too, that different regions are particularly interested in particular problems that the brain is solving. But each of these regions here is enormous. It's enormous. So this whole area here becomes active when you're watching a movie, or when you're reading your email, or when you're looking at a checkerboard. And it represents millions and millions of neurons. Many hundreds of millions of neurons are in this blob here. So, and here likewise, very large numbers of neurons. So on the one hand, we can look at one neuron at a time, and at the other hand, we can look at billions of neurons at a time, but there's a big disconnect between those two things. There's a huge difference. It's as if you could only study New York City either with a microscope or from a satellite from outer space. And you couldn't actually get to the human scale and see how human beings were interacting with each other. You would really not understand, for example, what is going on inside a factory, or what is going on inside a hospital, or what's going on at Wall Street, or why people stay up late in some parts of town and not others. So you need that kind of information at the intermediate scale between very detailed and very coarse. And in fact, it's that intermediate scale where we think almost everything that we're really fascinated by in terms of cognition and thought is occurring. Because the way that the human brain perceives or feels or thinks or remembers or plans and decides is not with single neurons, and it's not with large blobs. It's what are called circuits and networks of interconnected neurons. So the neurons that are connected to each other, both at long range and very locally. This is just a diagram showing you some of the major superhighways of brain connections. But these, remember, are just the largest ones of a brain that has trillions of connections of different nerve cells with each other. So what happens, for example, when I recognize Lulu Wang, is that first of all, that area in the back of my brain lights up because I'm seeing something visual, and then that information is processing. Then it ends up in an area around here that Winrich Freiwald studies that includes cells that detect faces. But then that is going to, it's going to be just some of the neurons back here that are active and just some of the neurons here that are active. A subset of neurons here, a subset of neurons here. And then they're going to call into some neurons in my memory because I recognize her as a familiar individual. And then that's going to call up some neurons in regions for emotional processing because I like her. And then between all of those pieces of information, that's going to then go to areas that promote decision and action. And that'll plan an action, and it will cause me to walk across the room. So all of that happened in 1 second. And each of those processes happened in a fraction of a second. And each of those processes involved millions of neurons turning on and off, and information sweeping through. And then a second later, a different set of information will be sweeping through millions of neurons, subsets of the neurons in many different parts of the brain, recruiting other neurons, shaping the activity of other neurons, and leading to output. And it's this level here in the middle that we think really interesting things are happening in the brain. Not at what we really want to be able to do is to be able to look at thousands or millions of neurons as that information is flowing through the brain during mental processes that allow cognition to occur. We want to meet in the middle with high resolution, but across the whole brain. So this is really what we posed as the goals of the Brain Initiative, what we could do now to really change our way of thinking about the brain. It's to develop and apply new technologies to map the circuits of the brain, to understand which cells are connected to each other, to measure the pattern of electrical and chemical activity within those circuits, that's those rapid turning on and off of millions of neurons, and to understand how their interplay creates our unique cognitive and behavioral capabilities. Now, this is a major goal, but it's not really something that was thought up on April 1st of 2013 before the big announcement on April 2nd of 2013. It's been clear for a very long time in neuroscience that this is what we really wanted to be able to do, to understand what's going on in the brain. But the thing that's happening now is that it seems like this is actually a goal that you could pose and make progress on, because there are already emerging technologies that are expanding what's possible in studying the brain. And these technologies are coming out of a lot of different fields. They're coming out of not just standard neuroscience, but for example, out of material science and nanoscience that lets people build tiny, tiny recording devices for recording from large numbers of individual neurons. There are advances that are coming out of the fields of microscopy and optics and engineering of different cameras that allow us to detect tiny signals that occur in different nerve cells in different parts of the brain. There are advances in molecular biology and genetics that allow us to observe when nerve cells are active by making the nerve cells generate flashes of light. And finally, there are advances of computer science that will allow us to actually interpret what comes out of those tremendously complex patterns of activity. And right as the Brain Initiative was being announced, a paper was published that sort of showed you both the beginnings and the need for how these technologies can be used to really understand how the brain is working. because this paper actually does show a whole brain and all the neurons in a whole brain and their patterns of activity. Using these fancy molecular biology tools and using advances in microscopy and optics and cameras. Now, this is not a human brain, this is a fish brain, but it's a wonderful fish because it's a transparent fish. And you can look right through this fish and see everything in its brain. And you can watch individual nerve cells flashing on and off. And you can see that it's a complex pattern, but it's a pattern. Like there's something going on here that's going back and forth between these two areas here. And then at some point the fish has an epiphany and the whole brain lights up for a minute or so. There. And you know, you can see that there's this very dramatic and dynamic pattern of activity flowing through the brain, through different places at different times. And what I really like about this movie is that it really gives you both a sense of that the Brain Initiative is possible and what's exciting about it, but it also shows you what we don't know at the same time. So here's what's exciting. You can look at these patterns and you can say, wait, there are patterns here. There are areas really far apart from each other in the brain that have activity that seems to be correlated. What does that mean? How are they connected to each other? What's going on there? So we're like Galileo pointing telescopes at the heavens for the first time. We're seeing things we never knew the brain did because we could never look at it this fast and in this much detail. Frame of reference, if this were a human brain imaging study, this whole fish brain would have been 1 pixel. The only thing you would have seen was that big flash where everybody went off, because you would just be seeing the average of everything in the whole brain. It would all be muddied together. So here's that high resolution. So we can start to see now thousands of neurons at once. But this also points out just as well what you don't know. It's like, well, what are those nerve cells? What were those flashes of lights? I was just watching stars twinkling in the sky, right? I didn't know what that meant. Which neurons were active? What was the fish thinking? What did it mean? Which ones were making other ones active? You can pose the questions that we don't know as well from looking at this movie as you can feel happy about what we do know. And so that really sets up what the other aspects of the Brain Initiative are, not just to watch these patterns of activity, but to understand them. For example, to realize that different nerve cells in different parts of the brain really have profoundly different functions, and that we need to study the whole brain to see how they interact together. Nerve cells are not all the same. For example, there are nerve cells deep within the brain that are strongly implicated in motivation and emotion, and they are connected to neurons in all other kinds of the brain, and they're important in regulating behaviors and cognition, and particularly in emotion. Many of the psychiatric drugs and even drugs of abuse that we have target these specialized neurons. So we need to be able to study not just one area, but how that area interacts with other areas. I call this the no neuron left behind part of the study. And another aspect of the brain that we think is really, so can we understand this? Well, I think we really can, and this is another technological advance that's really been moving the field forward that makes us feel that we can, in fact, understand, not just observe the brain, because observing is not understanding. And the reason we can now understand is because of the development of tools that allow you to effectively hack into the brains of animals and actually change the pattern of brain activity in ways that you define using a method called optogenetics. And this is really a remarkable method. It involves taking a gene out of an algae found in pond scum, and this algae responds to blue light, and you take the gene out of the algae and you put it into nerve cells in the rat. So now you have an animal that is 99.99% rat and 0.001% algae. But not really, right? What it really has now is nerve cells that can be activated by light. So that when you shine a light into the brain of this animal, the nerve cells that you chose to put this gene into will now become active. And you can ask, what happens when just those nerve cells become active? And this should blow your mind, actually, because it still blows mine. And here's an example of one of these experiments. It's in a brain region implicated in emotion, in territorial and aggressive behavior in rats. It's an experiment done by David Anderson, a former Rockefeller University graduate student. And this little mouse is running around in its cage, and we've thrown in a rubber glove, and when the light turns on, we've activated neurons that are involved in territorial defense and aggression, and the little mouse views this rubber glove as an intruder. Light goes off, it's just like, oh, what's this interesting thing? Let's sniff it, light goes on. Get rid of this guy, right? So this is actually eliciting a behavior. This is telling you that these neurons are actually able to sort of modify the mouse's behavior in such a way to drive these kinds of different responses to the same environment. So this lets us monitor what these cells are doing. Now, these things are really cool, and I think that they're the kinds of things we need to understand the brain, but we need to scale them up and we need to refine them. So, in terms of understanding things like activity, for example, we don't need to look at thousands of neurons. We need to look at millions of neurons at once to really solve the problems that I told you about. And in terms of something like optogenetics, the methods we're using now are sort of like poking the brain with a sharp stick. Whereas what you really want to be able to do is to sort of play the piano, is to play back patterns of brain activity associated with complex behaviors and understand which part of that pattern is really important for a particular memory of a particular place, for example. And finally, we're going to need a lot of conceptual advances. We're going to need theoretical and mathematical understanding. And putting all of these things together, building the technology and then understanding what comes out is going to be a major interdisciplinary effort, but ultimately one that has the potential to give both discovery of fundamental circuit properties and insight into the circuits relevant for brain function and disease, and to really accelerate basic science as well as medicine and technology. Now, there's a lot of talk about how to accomplish these goals. I think the main principles that emerged from our discussion is that this had to be a different kind of program, that it couldn't be science as usual, because scientists are each rewarded for staying in their own discipline. And we need to bring biologists and physical scientists together and reward them for crossing disciplines. We need to bring experimentalists and theorists together and reward them for working together rather than staying where it's comfortable. And then we also need to do other things if we're going to make this matter. For example, whatever technology exists is sterile until it's in as many hands as possible. We need to disseminate it. We need to share data as well as technology. We need to educate people as to how to use it. And finally, I'm sure it didn't escape anyone in this room that as you start to think about stimulating brains or even observing brains, that you start to develop ethical considerations, and that should be built into thinking about this project from the very first steps. You shouldn't wait to have problems, to have accountability to think about what would happen. So it's happening. It's kind of remarkable. There's a scientific plan. We were also charged with planning a budget. We did this to the best of our knowledge based on how much other similar projects cost and how much different parts cost. And we came up with a total investment of $4.5 billion over about a 12-year period, actually, as what would be required to really take these next steps. Now, I have to say that this sounded like a lot of money to me, and it was a while before I could say it without sort of choking. But on the ultimate scale of things, I want to remind you of a couple of other numbers. Remember, $200 billion a year to take care of people with Alzheimer's that we can't do anything for. We could talk about the amount of money paid as fines by certain banks after the financial crisis. If just one of those fines was dedicated to the Brain Initiative, it would all be solved. But it's, this is realistically, this is what science really costs. It's an expensive business, and but an exciting one. And it will include both technology development and discovery-driven science. And it's gotten started. The first 100 or so investigators have now been funded. And if you look at these grants, they're actually extremely exciting and original and interdisciplinary and everything we hoped they would be. And they include people just almost right out of graduate school with fabulous new ideas. And they include people who are great, highly established and have been in the field for a long time. And they include people whose names I didn't know because they're people who worked on Bell Labs on fiber optics and are now really thinking of new ways of developing fiber optics to study the brain. I think there's just tremendous possibility here for bringing in a different kind of science and starting a new science. So the Brain Initiative has officially launched. It launched on September 30th of this year. One of the announcements was that the $110 million of the first year was going to be turned into $300 million in the next year. So I think what we're seeing is that people are excited about this, that people are joining. And it's not just that the federal agencies are giving more money, which they are, but it's also other kinds of foundations have joined. For example, the Simons Foundation here in New York has a very exciting project on the global brain, on trying to understand global brain activity. And here's a really interesting part of the private sector that's gotten involved. A lot of people in the computer and technology industry have gotten involved. So why is that? Well, it's because people are now starting to use principles about how the brain works from brain technology to develop better computers, computers that use less power, and computers that can solve complex problems like face recognition and voice recognition are being designed around the way that our brains solve problems. So the way that human beings solve problems are now being used to make our computers smarter. And these people are joining the Brain Initiative, recruiting away postdocs from neuroscience labs, and thinking, and really communicating, voting with their feet to say, yes, we think this matters. We think this is really a good thing to happen. So just to close, I just want to close by sort of telling you that there are 3 reasons to be excited about this. You start something like this, you hope for the best, you hope that people will support it. I think the degree of support in the neuroscience community, in the larger community, and really even in what I think of as the real world, although people in California would debate that about the tech industry, but are really getting interested. I think there's something that will happen. And I think, it's important to say that this is a 10-year project for science, and that in the next 10 years, what we hope will emerge is really science, is really understanding. And often when we talk about projects, we feel a need to make them really practical. And in fact, there is that element to making things practical when we talk about the Brain Initiative. We want to understand brain disorders. But we know from other projects, we know from the war on cancer, that 10 years of science then lead to 10 years of medicine and biotech and pharma and engineering before the drugs come out. So if we don't start on studying the brain, then the progress we want will always be 10 years away. If we have that foundation, then we can move forward to build it into the practical applications in partnership with medical scientists and physicians, in partnership with the private sector to do what we want it to do. There may be faster applications in technology for understanding what things are. But I just want to close by telling you the real reason that I'm excited about the Brain Initiative, and that is that ultimately what the Brain Initiative is about excitement and about human achievement. I was born in 1961, and on the week that I turned 8, this man here, Neil Armstrong, walked on the moon. And I can tell you that this was what made me be a scientist. This is what made many children of my generation become scientists and engineers. And it was a tremendously positive and meaningful accomplishment of those times. And when we look back on those years, they seem as confused and with as many problems as the years we have now. The Vietnam War was going on, Watergate was just around the corner, but there was this tremendous American accomplishment of putting a man on the moon. And it was a great human accomplishment to do that. And whenever we, as a culture and as a society, have tried to do something really forward-looking and exciting, it's led to benefits that we don't even really understand, in this case in the form of technology. But I think that the real point is that there's nothing more magnificent that we could do as humans than to understand ourselves. And this is an idea that goes back into philosophy and literature and not just in science. And I think understanding the brain is one of the most wonderful things we could do. And I hope you will join me on that problem. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Corey, for a wonderful presentation. We'll now turn to the question and answer period, but I'm going to start by engaging Corey in conversation. And then after a few questions, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Maybe we should start at the beginning of this project. I know when the idea of the Brain Initiative was first put forward, you greeted it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Maybe you could share with us why you were skeptical, and did your thinking about the project change before you accepted the role as co-chair?
Yeah, so what Mark is referring to is that I tweet, And as soon as this was announced, I wrote a tweet that said, "What is this? Big science, central planning inside the Beltway?" Which was viewed as a skeptical response. And it was after this.
I wonder why.
It was after this that I was actually asked to be on the program. So after that came out, I was contacted by the National Institutes of Health, by Francis Collins and Story Landis. And they said, we really think there's something good to do here, and not all big science projects are bad, and the trick is that it shouldn't be top down, it should be bottom up, and we're giving you a chance to really put together a bottom up view of what the science should be. We're not telling people what to do, we're letting you tell us what's important to do. And so I sort of thought about it, and I called up many people that I knew who had been involved in various kinds of projects that I considered successful and unsuccessful, actually. So one person I called was Bruce Alberts, who recruited both Mark and me to UCSF, and who was subsequently the chair of a committee at the National Academy of Sciences that put together the planning document for the Human Genome Project. And I think everyone agrees that that was really a spectacularly successful, forward-looking plan and project that has had a major impact. And so I asked Bruce what was it that he thought was successful, how would he go about doing this, and our planning process was actually a direct imitation of the one that Bruce had done for the Human Genome Project for that reason. I also called up people who had been directors of projects that had not been viewed as successful, without necessarily informing them of that. Because in every field, you could have a conversation where people would say, well, good luck. I just hope it's not like X, where X has been some giant financial drain, badly run project in their field. And there were some pretty clear themes about what set those things apart, including people need to be able to collaborate, don't pile too much money in all at once, ramp up slowly over a long time, make sure that the ideas come up from the bottom, don't tell people what to do, just open the doors and let the best ideas win. And all of those were built into at least our thinking about what the BRAIN initiative should be. And I should say that NIH has responded to that, practically, in a practical way, but very much respecting what the planning group came up with.
And in your list of things that are necessary for success, sharing data and sharing the tools and technologies also, which you emphasize here in your talk, seems to have been a major theme as well.
And that really, one of the major things that made the Genome Project so successful was that people would literally release their data the day they got it. And if you're going to put a lot of resources into something, then you have to really make sure it's worthwhile. And data sharing is a way to make sure that you're having the maximum impact on the largest number of people. And I should say that that's been an ethic in the genome field for a while. And within the genome field, people will tell you that the projects where people shared have been much more impactful and important than the projects where people were selfish. And so it wasn't so much a part of the neuroscience culture. It's a little bit more complicated, but people are starting to do that. People are starting to share, they're making huge public shared databases of human brain imaging data. And it'll be like 500 petabytes of data that they call brain in a box, that you have to get sent to you that will actually show you these very complex data sets. So there's a huge data problem, but also opportunity for really asking yourself, what do 1,000 normal brains look like? How different are they? How similar are they?
So turning now to why the time is right. I mean, again, you emphasized in your talk that these technological advances, like the ability to visualize activity in nerve cells in a fish brain, and then optogenetics, the ability to change patterns of activity and see the consequences in terms of behavior, as with the mouse, were two very important technologies. Could you tell us, are there other technologies apart from those two that you think make this particularly the right time? That's the first part of the question. And then the second part is, what's your wish list? What technology would you like to see develop in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, that you think could take us to the next level?
So another technology that has really hugely advanced that I could have added on are the advances in the speed and power of computers. Because the amount of data that are generated even by these 80,000 neurons is tremendous. And it's not just a question of gathering the data. it's actually, you then have to develop analytical tools that can handle these very large data sets and extract patterns out of them. So, even if we could see the activity of all 86 billion neurons in your brain, there's no way to actually look at that all at once. But a computer, which is very patient, could look at it if it were powerful enough and patient enough. And then you could query the computer, ask the computer questions about what sorts of patterns existed to help you extract meaning from this incredible pattern of complex information. So I think that the advances in both just physically in computer science, but also more than that in the kinds of mathematics and analytical and statistical tools that people are using to think about very large data sets are important. And my wish list. I mean, I think that we have, I think that what we would really like to be able to do that we can't do is sort of listen in on all the different channels of communication on the brain. That one of the things about the brain is that it's very alluring to look at those patterns of lights flashing on and off. But in fact, everything that happens in the brain changes the structure of the brain. So it's a little bit different the next time it works. And also in the short term, things like emotional and motivational states make the brain function a little bit differently. We've all had these experiences of knowing when we're a little impatient that we miss things that we wouldn't have missed otherwise. All of the processing of information is sort of constantly fluidly changing. And so trying to monitor as many of those different pieces of information as possible, the fast information, the slow changes in structure. I'm afraid that's not a 5-year plan. But because we did put,
on the way.
Yeah, but I think there are, and I think that there are increasingly good ways of monitoring some of these other kinds of activity. And this is one of the things actually that emerged from the first round of proposals, is people that who had thought of completely new ways of looking at some of those other kinds of activity that were important, chemical activity and biochemical activity. Another really huge wish list is to be able to interact with brains what's called non-invasively, which means, we can actually record, and people have generated recordings from human brains at the sort of very fast single cell level, but that only happens during surgery, during an operation. So we've learned an unbelievable amount from studying the brains of patients who have epilepsy, where we had to take recordings while they were undergoing surgery, and they very generously spent some extra time doing some scientific experiments. And so if we could but you don't want to do surgery. Surgery is invasive. So we want to non-invasively be able to understand the brain, to interact with it. And again, some very clever ideas have been developed. Sarah Stanley, a very young scientist at the Rockefeller University, has ideas that involve using heat and radio waves to interact with the brain in particular areas to again, without invasively interfering with brain activity. And I think that will be something that we will have to develop when we ultimately want to think about human brains. We're just not going to be able to study human brains and non-human brains in the same way.
If we go back to the process of putting together the plan for the Brain Initiative, as co-leader of the working group, you communicated with a large number of scientists, both nationally, also internationally. You had a real unique vantage point on the whole world of neuroscience globally. Did any particular scientist or scientists' work or ideas truly surprise you? Are there things that you learned that you didn't know about, that you thought you had that wow moment?
I learned a lot over the time that I was doing this. And I would say that the part of neuroscience that I learned the most about was clinical neuroscience and what is and is not possible. I learned about a method called deep brain stimulation, in which people insert electrodes into the brains of people with Parkinson's disease and basically stimulate those electrodes to rebalance the pattern of nerve activity that happens because of the cell death and cell loss that occurs in Parkinson's, and allows people, even though many of their neurons have been damaged or have even died, to recover function. And I consider that a hugely optimistic piece of information in terms of the future possibility of circuit-level interventions in medicine. That you can take a brain where some cells have died And you can make it work more normally just by sort of quieting down some other cells that would normally be silencing it. So I learned about brain-computer interfaces. And I would say, as sort of at a personal level, I was really, the most enjoyable interactions I had ended up being with the more clinical scientists. And I had sort of an experience where when we were starting to get feedback, we were at one of these public meetings and a number of clinicians said, you really need to talk to clinicians, you really need to get the message out to them. And I listened, and then the meeting was over, and the NIH people ran up to me and they said, you don't need to talk to any of those doctors. And I thought, I think I'm gonna go talk to some of those doctors. And it was really, it was a great perspective. They were, for example, and they said, first of all, they were like, we get circuits, we think this is a really good idea, we really support you, let us know how we can help. And then second, they said, but think about the parts of the brain that are really important to us. So for example, neuroscientists all love the cortex. The cortex is, thoughts and perceptions and higher order processes. But neurologists say, we really care about the spinal cord. Movement is in the spinal cord. Pain is in the spinal cord. Don't forget other parts of the brain. Don't forget the parts that science tends to ignore because it's not quite as alluring, but that medicine thinks is really important. And that was, in fact, part of the sort of, we want to study the whole brain perspective came from those conversations.
You mentioned in passing the project that the European nations have started on, the Human Brain Project, which is to simulate the activity and the functioning of the human brain. So very different project. Can you say just a few more words about what they're hoping to achieve with that? And you mentioned also, at some point, maybe the two projects will intersect. Can you tell us how you see that happening?
So the principle, as I said, computing is going to be essential to understand anything as complicated as a brain. We're not going to be able to understand it intuitively. We will have to understand it with the help of computers, with the help of mathematics. The question is, do we know enough now to start to build those computers and make them work the way brains actually work? And I actually think the answer is no. I think we're still discovering things about the brain that are so different from what we expected, that if we want to understand not how a brain could work in theory, in principle, but how real brains work in reality, that we need more biology to put together, that we need to understand what the different cell types are of the brain and how they're connected together, rather than connecting them up at random and seeing what that network can do. So I'm a pretty big believer, and I also think that medicine involves real human brains here in the present. The European project is a computing project. It's literally being, it was founded by a project that was started by IBM. It was started by a hardware company. And it's got a lot of resources in hardware. And my feeling is they're going to do a lot of good work, and in 10 years or 8 years or some number of years, that will dovetail with the new knowledge that's coming out of experimental neuroscience, and then those things will really hook together in an exciting way. So I don't think either of these will solve the big problem on their own. And I think that having both of them running in parallel gives a much better chance.
Great. Good, so we will take questions now.
I've read some studies that demonstrate that exercise can slow down the normal atrophy of the brain and help to regenerate new brain cells. Would you comment on that?
Exercise is definitely good for you, which makes me very sad. Because I hate exercise. I think in the adult human brain, it's not so much about adding new nerve cells as it is maintaining the function of the nerve cells you have. Exercise is good for your blood vessels, which deliver food to your neurons. It's good for your glucose levels, and diabetes is bad for your brain. Pretty much the best thing we know to preserve your long-term brain health is exercise and social interactions with other people. Playing bridge is one of the best things you can do, actually. Challenging cognitive tasks with other people.
So now that the plan and the working group has done its initial work, now what will your role be in the next 10 years? And what are some of the early milestones that we might see happening?
So our working group is technically done with its job, but I remain a member of what's called the advisory committee to the NIH director. So I'm reporting to which effectively I'm being asked to keep track of what's going on there. And I'm also on the external advisory committee for what's going on inside the NIH. And this is great, because what the NIH is good at is administering, organizing, taking the grants in, making sure everything is being done properly. And they're really they're using so far, and based on based on everything that's happened so far, they've really been taking the outside advice of first the working group and now the advisory group very seriously, and responding to the intellectual input, really positively and reaching toward that group. So I think that I will, at this point, have the enjoyment of going back to my paying job, and while also maintaining sort of the ability to influence the intellectual direction in an ongoing way. In terms of milestones, I think there are certain things that are going to emerge pretty quickly. I think one of the things that's going to emerge really quickly is going to be a parts list of the brain, where we don't really, I mentioned that not all nerve cells are the same and that we need to study the whole brain. We don't actually know how many kinds of nerve cells there are. It's embarrassing. And so, to really just sort of say, okay, these are the parts, and you find these, and these are similar to those, I think that'll be worked out, actually probably in the next couple of years, and that will be sort of a first resource, a little bit like a draft, of the brain. And then you can start to say, okay, this part's connected to that part, and those things will emerge. Then there will also be some technologies that will just be about more and more neurons, sort of really taking that special fish and then being able to look at 1,000 neurons in a more complex animal, trying to really scale up those. And I think those things will be sort of Moore's law, like, we can do it 10 times as well, now we can do it 100 times as well, sorts of scaling up. And I think those are going to be the first advances.
Thank you so much. One of the things I appreciated most about your talk is how much you're highlighting what we don't know yet. And I think that on the one hand, there's a wonderful thing that's developed in the popular culture in the past 10 years or so, that people have an appreciation of the brain that wasn't available before. But there's also a tendency to commodify it and to idealize neuroscience as if we understand a lot. And actually what you're highlighting is how little we truly understand. I think that's very important. So I was curious, from a kind of a social history of science point of view, or just the social aspect of what you were doing in the working groups and the meetings that you were having, when you're bringing together leaders in different areas where everyone's very specialized and sort of committed to their perspective, what did you see evolving in terms of how much everybody was collectively able to acknowledge their individual ignorance and sort of the ignorance of the field? I'm curious to know about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was definitely the possibility in a group like that of everybody kind of digging into their corner and insisting on their way of doing things. And there were also definitely differences of opinion, particularly about strategy, like to what extent there should be very large, centralized groups working together, as opposed to what extent there should be different groups of people working independently of one another. But I think that from the outset, maybe this was a good thing about having 15 people from basically 15 different fields in the room. It wasn't like anybody was going to get anywhere if you couldn't convince a lot of other people from different fields that this was a good idea. And so we had to work in kind of a compromise way. And whether that was part of the dynamic or whether it just worked that way, people were not super attached to their own points of view. Having said that, I would say that for me personally, the hardest thing about the process from that kind of dynamics point of view was that at some point, people come to you and they say, where's my field in this? Why isn't my field there? And it's very hard to say no to people that you've respected for your entire scientific career and say, well, that's not really part of this. You can't do everything. You can't give $19.95 to every person working in the field of neuroscience. That's a way not to have an impact. But it's hard it's hard when you're talking to someone that you really respect to sort of say, this is not fitting in. And there was that process as well. It it was surprisingly positive. You know, you didn't feel like the human people and the animal people were on opposite sides, or the, you know, it was a surprisingly successful group. Yeah.
Corey, I wonder if you have a sense of how likely it is that the new Congress and perhaps future Congresses are to support the ramping up of funding that you propose in your report. And then secondly, what some of us scientists and non-scientists might do to help that happen.
So I've learned a lot about the government, but not that much. So the good thing is that last year in January, where this budget compromise was being hammered out in what appeared to be just as partisan environment as we have now, one of the few things that was actually added to the budget was money for the BRAIN Initiative, on top of what was being given to the NIH, sort of consciously not taking away from other projects. Congress voted to add money to the BRAIN Initiative. So I think that that is an incredibly positive statement about the degree to which supporting biomedical research and health research is not a partisan issue. And it has not historically been a partisan issue because, in fact, if you look historically, Republicans have been very strong supporters of science and of the National Institutes of Health. I think that there is currently a libertarian streak that might not support that, but I'm not even so sure about that. One of the strongest supporters of research is Orrin Hatch from Utah, who's a Republican. I don't see this as a partisan issue. I think everyone has concern about brain disorders, and I think that even conservative economists believe that basic research has to be done by the government. Companies can't afford to do it. Their stockholders will not stand for it. This kind of long-term, send out 10 ships so that one will come back in thinking has to be the role of a society and a community. So what can we do? I think if people express excitement about these projects, I think it's good. I think that the tech community expressing interest in this is one of the best things that could happen. I think having people who are not neuroscientists say, this is really good. I think having the medical community say, the basic science here is something we need is really good. I think if there's a sense of consensus, it's not just, I want more for me, but this is something that will benefit the community. I think that's where, so I think that, what do I think that means? I think that means that we have an impact, not just when we personally talk to congressmen, but when we talk to people we know who are not scientists, and get them interested in this and think that they will have influences in their communities as well.
You mentioned on a personal level the inspiration you got from the Apollo program. I was wondering if through your journey and success, have you also thought about could a breakthrough such as the one that you are helping pursue help create more gender equality in science?
Gender equality, and the world is imperfect, but improving. People who are 10 years older than me weren't even allowed to be undergraduates at Columbia or Yale or the University of Virginia. People who were 10 years older than that, it was legal to discriminate against them and not give them a job. People who were 10 years older than that, literally they would go to places and be told, we don't hire women. I mean, I think you look at our culture and overall things are getting better and you can't give up. But you can't get discouraged and you can't give up. I think that I like to think that having more women in science will make it seem as natural to be a woman as a scientist as it seems to be a doctor now, because when my sister went to medical school, only 5% of the students in her medical school class were girls, and now it's over 50% and nobody talks about it. So I would just like to think that, by setting examples, by being conscious of our own preconceptions, that those numbers will change around. But I don't think it will come specifically from studying the brain on one way or another. I don't think that studying the brain in itself is going to be something that tells us, oh, everyone is equal. In fact, I think what studying the brain is going to tell us is that everyone is different. But I do think that it's an area that women as well as men can clearly be interested in, and it's an area where women as well as men have been very successful and continue to be successful, and maybe that's the right way to think about it.
Corey, you mentioned that research on the brain is such a large enterprise that it has to be embraced by our governments and not just by the private sector. Are there other governments in the world who are doing what we're doing now in the US? You mentioned the European initiative. Are there other countries around the world that are also beginning to recognize this importance?
Yeah, and in fact, there's now a Japanese brain initiative, and they're focusing on a few aspects of the molecular biology tool development part, and actually on developing a genetic system in non-human primates, in studying marmosets, actually. There's a Chinese brain initiative that's getting started, but apparently it's still extremely fractious what exactly that's going to be. And so I hear different things at different times about whether it's going to be very scientific or very clinical or how those things are working. There's an Australian brain initiative. There's an Israeli brain technology initiative. So there is a sense of there's a sense that this is the time, right? There's a sense that a lot of groups are saying, yes, this is the time to get involved in those. Science is international, you know. Science is funded nationally, but information is shared internationally. And I don't think we should think of this as the American Brain Project, but rather as something that will be good for our understanding of brains wherever we are. I think when you think about things like medical and technology development, those will tend to grow up wherever the sciences happen. That's why Silicon Valley is right next to Stanford, right? And so that might be an economic incentive for the US to continue to support it and not just say, oh, well, the Chinese will do it, we don't have to. I don't know, but in any case, I do think the short answer to your question is I think that there's a lot of interest in this, and you see it coming up quite well.
Everyone's sharing.
Pardon?
And everyone is sharing as we are?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I talk about sharing. Obviously, you talked about DARPA being one of your funders here, and I wonder if you could tell us, is there any classified research going on, and what DARPA's interest and role will be in this research?
So I'm sure there's classified research going on, but I don't know what it is. So I have no clearance. What DARPA has chosen, so I think this is something that people wonder about, like why is defense interested in the brain? Are they trying to make, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Terminator-style super soldiers? And the answer actually is no. So DARPA's interest is that both in active military personnel and in veterans in the VA, their major problems are brain disorders. So you probably know, we've probably read that in the past 3 or 4 years, more members of the military have died of suicide than have died in enemy action. They have tremendous problems with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. They have horrendous problems with traumatic brain injury and problems like that. And it's really considered they really feel an imperative to care for their soldiers and to care for their veterans. And the first 2 projects they're doing are deep brain stimulation and recording technologies to try to work with people, you know, with those sets of disorders, just the ones that I described: traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, suicidal depressions. So I think it's very human-based, and they're very, you know, I've seen their first few proposals. They're open to discussion. They're very gadgety. That's what DARPA does really well, is sort of the engineering parts and trying to build machines. But I think that's also a strength that can be exploited and that will come together with these other approaches.
I know there are many, many more questions. Unfortunately, we want to be respectful of everybody's time, so please join me in thanking Corey for a wonderful